Thank you. And good evening to our audience here in Washington, Hilton, in our nation's capital. I am Amaru, and on behalf of everyone in the League of Women Voters of the United States, I want to say welcome to our members from across the United States. And I cannot do it from there, actually. Sorry. This is my first time with a teleprompter, if you can, yes. So I just want to welcome everybody because we are so excited that we are back in DC for our convention. Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Alma. I am Kelly McFarland Stratman, and I want to extend that welcome to our virtual audience joining us on Facebook. Tonight's panel is on an important and timely topic, and we appreciate that technology is allowing us to share it with a wider audience.
So when we cast our votes for our president, you know that we aren't voting for the president, right? We're voting for intermediates. We're voting for electors from each party who select the president on our behalf. 5 times in American history, the person elected for president did not have the most votes, but was elected by the Electoral College. The Electoral College is a group of people in each state elected by political parties who act as a proxy for voters in selecting the president. And this spring, the League launched One Person, One Vote. Woo! Our long-term campaign to drive a movement that will eliminate the Electoral College. Together, all of us, we will move our nation beyond the archaic, racist Electoral College and towards true representation for all.
So later in the program, we will be sharing more about how you can get involved in One Person, One Vote, how we can all work to dismantle this racist system and build a democracy that is powered by the people and for all the people. And we have an opportunity for you to engage tonight. For those of you tuning in online, you are welcome to post questions to the panel in the chat. And there are some note cards for those of you in the room on your tables, and staff will be around to gather those questions throughout the panel. But right now, let's get to it. We'd like to begin our panel presentation. We have brought together an impressive group of experts to share their views on the Electoral College. So I want to welcome tonight's panelists to the stage, as well as our moderator for this evening. I want to welcome Selena Stewart, our Chief Counsel for the League of Women Voters of the United States.
Hello, League. Okay, we're going to have to fix this. There we go. Okay. Hello, League. How are we tonight? Thank you, Alma and Kelly, and everyone who is joining us tonight. I'm Selena Stewart, and it's my pleasure to introduce our remarkable panelists this evening. By a show of hands, how many of you have attended a panel or talk about either the Electoral College or the National Popular Vote? No surprise. A good number of us, right? But how many times have, you attended a panel on this topic featuring all women? Yes, that deserves an applause. Well, I know I haven't. Oftentimes we hear men, no offense, talking about the Electoral College, and then the women are called on to do the work. Tonight, we'll be hearing from 3 dynamic women who are pushing the boundaries to power a real conversation about this important topic and pushing for change for a fair and more representative voting process. Joining us tonight are Nyala, pronounced like umbrella, Amaru, an advocacy and policy strategist with experience in organizing around structural reforms, Carolyn DuPont, professor of history at Eastern Kentucky University, and Keisha Gaskins-Nathan, Program Director of the Democracy Practice at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Just to share, yes, you can clap. Just to share a little more about our esteemed panelists, Nyala is a nationally recognized political strategist and campaign architect with an established track record influencing public policy through gender justice and the racial equity lens. Am I? She has led transformational issue campaigns and commanded high-level leadership roles in nonprofit organizations and government, where her advocacy work amplifies diverse voices in legislative conversations. Nyala's political impact in mobilizing grassroots efforts to progress social justice issues has positioned her as a sought-after speaker, thought leader, and media commentator. She holds master's degrees, yes, plural, in public administration, public policy, and urban affairs, dual bachelor degrees, come on, Nyala, for real, dual bachelor degrees in political science and criminal justice, and is currently completing her PhD in political science. Please join me in welcoming Nyala. Next, we have Caroline Dupont, author and professor of history at Eastern Kentucky University, where she specializes in African American history and American religious history. I'm also a religion major, by the way. Her book, Mississippi Praying, Southern White Evangelicals and the Civil Rights Movement, 1945 to 1975, won the Frank and Elizabeth D. Brewer Prize from the American Society of Church History in 2014. In September 2024, upcoming, Prometheus Press will publish her most recent book, Distorting Democracy, The Forgotten History of the Electoral College, and Why It Matters Today. Her opinion writing has appeared in the Huffington Post, the Washington Post, among other outlets. Last but certainly not least, Keisha Gaskin-Nathan is a program director. We know Keisha, right? Many of us in the room know Keisha because she has funded our work. She is the program director, Democratic Practice, United States, and Racial Justice Initiative at Rockefeller Brothers Foundation. Keisha is a longtime organizer, lobbyist, and trial attorney. Prior to joining Rockefeller Brothers Fund, she was the senior counsel with the Brennan Center for Justice, serving as the director of redistricting and representation program. She is dedicated to advancing measures and ideas that improve democratic systems and engage democratic culture in the U.S. to support full and fair opportunity for all residents. By the way, Keisha is also a longtime league member. She was the executive director of the League of Minnesota. Yes, so Minnesota in the house. And when I have been on panels with Keisha, she often tells me info about the league that the average person just doesn't know. And she surprises me, even me. Finally, she is the 2021-2022 Daynard Public Interest Fellow at the Northeastern University School of Law, International and Public Affairs 2019 Aspen Ideas Scholar, and the 2008 Feminist Leadership Fellow with the University of Minnesota, Humphrey H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs, Center on Women and Public Policy. She has been featured on Background Briefing, The Great Battlefield, PBS NewsHour, MSNBC, and Bill Moyers. Now, are y'all excited about this panel? I am. So let's get into it. Okay. Hello. Good evening, everybody.
Hello.
How you doing?
Hi.
Well, let's jump right in. How would you all describe a healthy democracy? What does that mean to you? Carolyn, you want to start?
Sure. So I think when we think about democracy, democracy means many things. But if we want to only focus on the aspect of democracy that has to do with voting and how our elections are structured, I think there are probably 4 things that I would say characterize a healthy democracy. And I think the first one would be that we vote in ways that are based on important, widely shared values. Secondly, I think that we all show up with equal power at the ballot box, that some people who live in one state don't have more power than those who live in another state, or no one has less power because they don't vote with the majority in their state. I think a healthy democracy involves transparency about how the process works. I noticed one of our introducers commented that, you don't vote for a president, you vote for an elector, but how many of y'all know the name of the elector that you voted, or of the electors that you voted for? I think most of us don't. And we shouldn't have to have videos that say what happens when you vote, because we should know what happens when we vote. It should be a transparent process. And then finally, I think a healthy democracy would include systems that produce candidates that Americans feel good about supporting.
Keisha, what about you? What's a healthy democracy?
So, I'm sorry. First of all, good evening, everybody. How are we today? That was terrible. We're going to do this again. Good evening. All right, now I know I'm amongst friends and we can do this. So when I think about a healthy democracy, I think about the shape, as we think about at the RBF. We're not a democracy program, but a democratic practice program. That means we're looking at our democratic systems and our democratic culture and the Venn diagram, where those cross over, where we talk about our democratic practice. How do we actually engage in the practice of democracy, and what does that look like, and what is the crucible within what that rests? And for that, we need a strong liberal democracy. And I mean liberal in the very political sciencey term, not in the partisan term. And in that case, we're talking about Republican principles, democracy principles, constitutionalism, and liberalism. And that shows up with a country that operates on majority rule in the strictest democratic sense, with minority protections against the tyranny of the majority, a rule of law that applies to everybody and protects everybody, and people are the mechanism through which power to govern is derived, versus authoritarian spaces where elections can still be had, but the power to government actually doesn't derive from people. And it's incredibly important that we notice that it's not just the function and mechanics of elections, but the actual practice of how we actually elect, and that those mechanisms actually show up in our formal and informal processes to actually give and reflect the power of governance.
Can you all hear us okay? Okay. Just want to make sure. Nayela, you want to close us out?
I love this question because I think for me, democracy is both process as well as outcome, but most importantly, the connection between those two, right? And so it's the importance of those connections, which is essentially what builds us our bridge. And I think that bridge can be built primarily in 3 different ways. From my perspective as an organizer and all the other hats that I wear. First and foremost is accessibility and responsiveness. It's been alluded to on the stage, but some folks in the current political system, sometimes their vote is more valued. And in a healthy democracy, in the vision that I'm building towards, is that it's about responsiveness and its accessibility, but that also requires public participation and engagement. We are all well learned, I'm sure, in the trials of trying to get, sometimes our folks to come out to the polls or to get engaged, but that is such a core part of how do we get to this democracy that lives and thrives and is not just dependent on the triple prime voters that come out every election cycle. And the other component I think is absolutely integral that I've seen has such an important impact on the issues is reflective policymaking. And this falls under, I think, like the umbrella of co-governance. Government should not be thought of as this separate abstract thing that happens to people, but oftentimes in the communities that I come from, that I work with and work on behalf of, it is. And so I think just kind of shifting that thought process as government as a separate entity and moving us towards a democracy where it's realized that democracy is us, government is us, government is rooted in the power of the people, and that people is us. And those are the things that I think of when I think about building a healthy democracy.
Awesome. I love your reference to bridge building. I always say that either you're a bridge or you're glue, depending on what the situation is. So let's talk about the glue or bridge. What is the connection between the Electoral College and this effort going around the country, the National Popular Vote, Interstate Compact? Let's put that to our historian. You want to answer that for us?
Yes. So and I'm going to use the language NPVIC, National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, is essentially a workaround the Electoral College to ensure that the winner of the National Popular Vote does in fact occupy the White House. Mm-hmm. And many of the most important reforms in our history have actually begun at the state level. And working at the state level on reforms like this raises people's awareness about the problem of the Electoral College. And so, on the one hand, I'm all for the NPVIC because it will do all those things. I do have concerns about it in that it could be subject to constitutional challenges. And I also have concerns that people could feel aggrieved, and possibly rightly so. So I live in Kentucky. The Republican candidate will likely win Kentucky, but if Kentucky were to give its electors to the Democratic candidate, I could understand how some Republican voters in Kentucky might feel betrayed by that. And we want an election system that makes everybody feel they were heard and treated fairly. And so those are some of my concerns about the NPVIC, but I would say, let's work on it. Let's pull out all the stops and work from every angle we can. But for me, the goal and the most secure way to make sure that every vote is equal is a constitutional amendment that abolishes the Electoral College. And if I could just remind everyone, I don't know how many people know this, but in 1969, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a constitutional amendment abolishing the Electoral College with 83% of Congress voting in favor of that amendment. And that's pretty stunning. They only needed 66 votes, but they had, 66%. But they had 83%. And so, and 81% of the American public supported that amendment. Now it was killed by a filibuster by segregationists in the Senate. But, I think we've come that close. I think we can do it. And I would like us not to take our eyes off that goal.
So that reminds me, abolishing the Electoral College, this effort has been attempted 700 times or so. I'm just wondering from the panelists, one of the things that I've noticed is that it has been missing a grassroots component. So how might a grassroots component, since we have all of these grassroots folks in the room, how might that power be leveraged now? Nayela, maybe I'll start with you.
I love this question. Grassroots organizing is how we win. Without question. What I've learned from my beginnings as an organizer, I worked on tenant rights issues in my beloved Georgia, to now in New York, where I currently reside.
And cause trouble.
Good trouble. Shout out to my former boss, the late Congressman John Lewis. Yes. I'll go off script, off my notes. I learned an important lesson under Congressman John Lewis in terms of movement building and changing systems and bringing about reform through light and heat. The simplest version is heat is the action, it's the people, it's the boots on the ground, and light is the education, it's the awareness. And I think that touches on the multi-pronged approach of the power of grassroots mobilizing is the importance of education, just bringing in awareness. A lot of people just don't know. I think sometimes there's the concept of apathy, which is certainly an issue, is tossed out as a reason, and I would not say that it's not. But I think oftentimes it's so powerful when you teach people what they need to know to empower them with the tools, with the information. And I think that through that education, we have the power to highlight the inequities of the current system, particularly for folks who may not necessarily be aware of the disparities that currently exist within it. And again, it's through that highlighting of the inequities that you bring in awareness. It's the light that brings fire to the people, that mobilizes them into action. And of course, that has an impact on the overarching strategy of advocacy. I think it's important to note that advocacy at both the state level as well as the federal level is key. And one of the things I want to acknowledge as someone who has been on both sides of the national organizing and the local, hyper-local organizing, is to acknowledge the tension oftentimes that can come when sometimes national organizations that can oftentimes be well-funded with all good intentions will go into local fights with their own mapped out strategy, but not having an understanding of the nuances of how you need to build relationships and invest with folks on the ground, so that the win that you're trying to get does not dissipate on election day, but real community power building requires long-term investment. And that begins with an investment that goes beyond whatever cycle you're trying to work within, with that long-term vision in mind of community power building. And last but certainly not least, and I would argue probably most importantly, it is on-the-ground coalition building. I've worked a lot of issue campaigns, a lot of electoral campaigns, and the more diverse your coalition, the stronger you are. We all have...
Yes.
There's so much talent in this room and so much experience as well as beyond it. And I have found with every campaign that I didn't think that I would win, but I always fight for, the longer fight. We won because we expanded beyond the core of the everyday people who people were always used to dealing with in the state houses or in Capitol Hill. But when I introduced a new crew of characters, and those characters brought in their stories and their friends and their families, the conversation changed, because now you're not just talking to Nayela, who you meet with multiple times a week, or the folks who you're used to meeting with to talk about this issue. You're really centering the everyday people who are impacted by these structural inequities, and that changes the conversation in a way that I have found to always be the most powerful and transformative moments when we're talking about, let's expand who we are used to working with, and let's really tap into our collective talents, our collective experiences, and our collective perspectives to really lead towards transformative change and lead to democracy reforms.
Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned apathy, because apathy is a word that irritates me. And I think it was our co-CEO, Alma, who articulated in a way that was like, aha, like that is why I'm irritated, because it's so complex. The things that lead to people not doing what is expected or what people think they should do is oftentimes based on epigenetics. I'm not going to tell the story about the cherry blossom and the mice, but it's often because of trauma that comes from intergenerational past. And so all of those things are coming against you when you're just trying to make everyday decisions. And so we have to think about apathy in a much different way, instead of victimizing the people who have already been victimized. So Keisha, I want to talk with you, because we started talking about grassroots movements, but you know grassroots movement, and you also know the League.
Yes.
So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on how the League and our grassroots movement could be critical at this time.
So structural reform demands civil society to be a driver, period, I'll stop, right? We want our elected officials to be leaders and champions of this issue, but of issues around structural democracy, specifically issues like abolishing the Electoral College. But sometimes we lose sight of the fact that that actually is asking folks to shoot the horse they rode into power on. And that actually the drivers of change and the drivers of reform are going to come from places and community. When we think about spaces like the League, I love Carolyn's point that Congress voted in 1969 to abolish the Electoral College after the League did it in 1968.
Thank you. See, I told y'all. She always has fun facts.
And it
Let's
was
be
fully
clear, they were all afraid of George Wallace.
I don't know, I ran the League, I know who they're afraid of. But I think that being in partnership with the local leagues and understanding what it means to be in community and at the community level, understanding very deeply that communities are intelligent collectives of people who understand what they need. And when Naima talks about education, I mean, that is the connective tissue. It is not that we're giving them some sort of magical power, right? People know what they have and they know what they need, but they're not always able to connect the dots. And the League has always been a very important place around connecting those dots.
Yeah.
I have moved many, many times in my adult life, and every time I go into a new community, someone says, and I'm trying to figure out the legal structure. When I moved, or the political structure, when I moved to New York City, I was like, so there's a city council, and there's community boards, and there's a president of the sport, like, what is all this? And I went straight down to LWV, New York City, and they explained it to me. And they helped me understand where I wanted to enter, what it meant to be a citizen, and what it meant to engage. And those are the understandings of the structural issues, so people can actually understand why these structures, when they're connected to their desires, and that disconnect between their ability to express their power within the formal systems of our democracy and our informal systems, and when they're largely unsuccessful over and over and over and over again, that's when the structures come into play. And it feels to me that the League is such an essential place, particularly when the League works effectively in partnership with, I think, the amazing way that the League can come in with lots of knowledge, but with also humility and grace, in a way that really allows communities to shine through those relationships. So I think the League has got a very long and important history of understanding the large systems, the ability to be in community on the ground, deeply understanding the structural dynamics and dynamism of the political systems where they operate in at the most local of all levels, and being able to translate that in partnership to all communities around them for the future. Mm-hmm. That's you guys, by the way.
So I talked about, who has drove this conversation for so many years. I just wonder if women are in the driver's seat and the men who are so graciously supporting the movement, how does that change the conversation around the Electoral College, the impact of it, and the national popular vote? You want to start?
Sure, I can go. The narrative will absolutely change because the people leading the conversation will change. Women, we represent so many different lived experiences that are framed by our identities, which impact how we move throughout life, which impact how policy specifically shows up for better or for worse. But one of the things I've found really important in grassroots organizing is the importance of sharing our stories. We can go through different experiences, take away different lessons, and sometimes, more often than not, we feel like we're the only one who's going through that particular situation. And then when we find the vulnerability to share our scars with someone else or with a room full of people, you realize that you're not the only one who is suffering from that particular experience. or even if someone didn't have that same exact experience, they recognize the pain, they recognize the consequences of having something fundamentally unfair happen to you. And I found that when you're able to connect with people on an emotional, human level, it opens the door to them, bring them into this journey, to not talk about the technical deficiencies of the Electoral College, yes, but start with the connection first, with the understanding that we all have gone through some experience that has been so fundamentally unfair, that has taken away our agency to live our lives in a way that we want to. And most importantly, we have the power to change that collectively. And that conversation begins one-on-one. It begins in room of chapter, League of Women Voters chapters meetings. It begins with outreach. And that's something that I found that women tend to lean into, is not being afraid to open ourselves and to share our stories. And to use that connection, again, as an invitation into a longer journey of emotional connection in its own process, through education, through awareness, through grassroots mobilization, through advocacy at both federal and the state, can lead us to dismantling the Electoral College, because we are all suffering under a system that leaves us in such an unfair representative state, but we all have the collective power to change that, and that begins with those one-on-one conversations of connection.
Thank you.
Selena, can I challenge the question?
Oh, I was coming to you. Go. Go.
So what would it mean for women to be in the driver's seat? As a student of movements, I have yet to see a movement where women have not always been in the driver's seat. I think this movement, like many others, women are not fully engaged around the face of the movement or the narrative of the movement. Yeah. But this, like any other movements, would be nowhere if women weren't driving it forward. And I think the challenge of that, goes back to Naila's really important points, that failing to center the stories and experience of women while expecting women to continue to be the workforce that moves it forward is a disconnect that actually will ultimately result in failure. The drivers of the work must also be the face of the movement, must also be the narratives and the storytellers of the movement. And every time we see that, when women actually step forward and become that tip of the spear, and when women fall back, we see a failure of those same movements, right? Whether it's everything from the civil rights movement, globally, indigenous movements for democracy and rights of land and water, right? This is where we see women sacrificing themselves. They're at the front, absolutely, in all these spaces. Trans women at the front of the Stonewall riots, right? Mm-hmm. And when trans women and other women fell back from being the front of the gay rights movement, we saw how it changed, and now how trans folks are now the tip of the spear to undermine all the work that's been done. Right? That failing to center women and failing to center those experiences while always expecting women to be the workers of every movement is consistently a failure. And so I would say women are in the driver's seat. There is no movement that hasn't been driven by women. And the question becomes, are we prepared to shift the face and the narrative of this particular conversation so the stories of women are centered for the success of this to arise?
Thank you. Carolyn, you want to weigh in here? I know you have some interesting points, the 3/5, the 5/5, fifths. I don't know.
So I want to answer this question historically, because when we think about how the Electoral College is set up and structured, of course, we all know that the number of electors that a state gets is based in part on the population of that state, which includes the women. And it has always included the women in the population from the very beginning. And so if we want to think about the Electoral College, and we do, as a means whereby electoral power has been unequally distributed, this is one of the ways that it was always, until 1920, distributed away from women and given to others on our behalf. And so we all know about the 3/5 clause, but for women, it's always been a 5/5 clause. And so we are counted as whole people in the population, but until 1920, not allowed to vote in most states. So I think that that's one way that can help us think about how the Electoral College has worked historically unequally on different sectors of the population.
Thank you. I have another question for you all. Very relevant question, I hope. The 2024 election is just 130 days away. So close. There are a lot of things happening domestically and abroad. So what would you say to those voters who are still balancing how they might engage in November? Let's start with Keisha. You want to take this? You want to start, Keisha?
I find this moment in political history, this moment where we are, to be a moment of great moral and ethical courage for everybody. And at no point should we ever suggest that people should advocate their moral position in order to engage in a certain way that we would define on their behalf that they should engage. And I think that's the first thing we have to see and understand. I think secondly, we do have some challenges with particularly young folks having a clear understanding of how expression shows up. What do I mean? Silence and boycott are magnificently effective ways of expressing political outrage and accountability in economic and social media contexts. I withhold my dollars, I withhold my attention, I withhold, and they understand that very acutely. This is what I walk away with and walk away from. But that doesn't translate into politics, right? That withholding my voice, withholding my vote, withholding these actions actually undermines, advocates my power, and causes me to walk away from the very issues I care about the most. And allowing those two things to be held together at the same time is a challenge of the moment that we're in. To understand that the governing class, period, has a long way to go to meet the needs of the American people. And we have to understand what that means. For so many folks, we are recognizing that people are not choosing a champion. They are simply choosing the battleground for which their next fight is to be had. And so I think as we think about what are the opportunities, what are the options, how do we think about this, I think the first thing we do is honor people's moral convictions. Honor them and recognize them, and that's where we start. I think the next step is saying, of those moral convictions, where does that lead you to how you express your power? And how does that show up in both informal and formal systems? How does that help you recognize that there's way more than one election on this ballot, right? We're going all the way down, that we have repro on the ballot, and we could have up to 14 states by the time we get to November that may have it on the ballot. Like this is a real time. And so as we think about these questions and as we think about these challenges, I think that's how I think about that balance. It's really honoring people from where they sit, recognizing the challenges and where we are, but also being able to clearly express what it means to express and hold power. And what does that mean to make that voice heard so you're not advocating your power, but holding it, expressing it, and moving it forward for the changes people wish to see in the world.
Amen. I mean, great. Got where it was.
I don't
It
think,
sounded like a sermon, so I said amen.
Well,
Carolyn?
yeah, I don't think I have anything profound or deep to say about this, except that I'm a blue voter in a red state, in a red county. My candidate never wins, but I go and vote every single time. And my daughter is here. And I remember the first time I voted, and I brought her in the booth with me. And it's just important. Because I know my grandmother was well into adulthood before she could vote. And so I just think I value the vote, and we all need to value the vote. And so there's just not a question there. I'm going to show up and I'm going to vote. And then the other thing I would say, excuse me, is politics is just so imperfect. And we just have to accept that. And we have to work with the system that we have and keep working on it and make it better.
Have any of you all found a perfect candidate? I'd love to know. Okay, no hands, no hands.
Would be nothing for us to do if it were all perfect.
I'm just saying there's never a perfect candidate. It's always choosing. We're always making a choice.
Yeah.
Nyla, you want to close us out on this question?
I love this question because there's layers to it. Layers that are frustrating to me, as well as an assignment for me to continue the work that I've been doing, and a call to action for the rest of us in this room. I think for me, I've always challenged folks who say they don't want to participate because they don't like the candidate or because the system is XYZ, to ask themselves, what does power mean to you? Because once you're able to define it, you're able to exercise it, you're able to build it, and you're able to build it collectively, which will change the points that you're frustrated with within the system. And I found even throughout my own journey, I started off as an organizer, knocking on doors, advocating for housing rights in Atlanta. And power meant to me at that time organizing rallies, holding elected officials accountable. When I worked on the Hill, power was information. When I've led political caucuses at the city council, power was maintaining a voting block, which is its own exercise. And so my own understanding of power has evolved as I've been exposed to it in different ways within our political processes, our policy systems. But it's such a fundamental question, and I think that so many of us, sometimes don't challenge ourselves by thinking deeply with it, and challenging folks within our circles, and most importantly, folks who do not feel engaged in the system, because through that exercise, I have found that what you understand as power is only one aspect of it, and my work as an organizer is always to expand it. To always build the bigger we is my role primarily as an organizer, and I do that by challenging folks to shift the paradigm of thinking that power is something that is formal, power is something that is firm, power is something that is not changing, but it does, and it has, and it will. But it can only do that through our collective movement in our engagement, by bringing folks along with us and meeting them where they are, along with us in our journey, because collective power building is the only way that we can win. And again, that begins with our conversations with ourselves, conversations with our families, and conversations as we move forward in reimagining a democracy and finally having a government that works for, with, and by the people is how we win.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, y'all, we got questions from the audience and online. I did not prep y'all for these, but we're gonna go through them. Okay, first question. The Electoral College was created to appease the slaveholder. Considering the growth in minority voters, how do we deal with the old man power loss fear?
What did? How do we deal with the old man power loss fear?
Power, fear, loss,
Fearing they're losing their power.
Yeah.
The fear of losing power.
So slaves wouldn't count. Now white men are being overthrown by the minority population growing, and they're terrified. How do we deal with it? Thank you.
Thank you. Lady in the back.
So I don't like to say that the Electoral College was created because of slavery. I think that's slightly inaccurate. And in history, accuracy is not a virtue, it is an obligation. And so the presence of slavery helped determine the shape of the Electoral College. but it's not why they chose an electoral college. And if you want to learn more about that, you can pre-order Distorting Democracy
Well done.
on Amazon.com. But I mean, I think it is clearly a fear, and I'm sorry, I just jumped right into this question, answering this question, but I think it is clearly a fear of losing power. But let me ask a question. Do you know, who knows, from which state Donald Trump got more votes than any other in the United States? Which state gave him the most votes? California. There are 6 million Republicans in California who were unrepresented in the Electoral College. And so I think that what we need to say and help people understand is that abolishing the Electoral College is good for everyone. And yes, we would have a better Republican Party today if we had no Electoral College, because they would have been forced to respond to the whole theory of democratic accountability. And they've not been forced to do that. And I think it's also important for us, and we'd have a better Democratic Party too. And I'm all for systems that make our parties better. But I think another thing that we need to appreciate and understand is that historically, 7 times an amendment to alter or abolish the Electoral College has passed one house of Congress or the other, and they've always been bipartisan. And the biggest champions of abolishing the Electoral College during Reconstruction were Republicans. And, you know, it's become a partisan issue, but that is only since 2016. And you can actually look at the polling on the Electoral College. Since 1944, it's been well over 60% of Americans wanted to do away with it. And it's climbed up into the 80s, and the only time it's dropped below 50% was just briefly after the 2016 election. And then this narrative began to be put out, oh, this was something that the founders created, you know, so that occasionally the minority could win. That's baloney. Order the book. But I think that that's what we want to emphasize, is that this has always been a bipartisan impulse, and it's good for all of us.
I just want to make a note that the views of the panelists are individual views. The League is a nonpartisan organization.
Yes, and I know that.
It does not support or endorse, does not support or oppose candidates. Just want to make sure to put that out there, because it's also on Facebook. Anybody else want to answer the question? If not, I have another. I live in a rural area of Colorado, and many in the rural area feel that the Electoral College offers them greater representation over populated urban cities. How do I explain that their vote may not be as potent with the Electoral College?
That rural voters' votes are not as potent with the Electoral College? It's not rural versus urban. We're being told that it's rural versus urban, but it is not.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And if you want statistics, by the way, when people say that, ask them for some data, because they make these assertions with no data. If you want some data, look at Texas, which has, 5 large cities? And they're still red. You know, so it's not because the cities are overpowering.
But I think there's also a broader point here. I feel so often, because voting is so personal, we all go into the ballot box, we cast our ballot, but it's really about the collective, the impact that we have as a collective. And so if we're only thinking about our vote, what we're doing, and not the impact that it has on the democracy that we live in, the people around us, the services that are available, who has access to those things, then I think we miss part of the point. And so I just want to dovetail that we have to get out of the mentality of, because we're always pitting ourselves against something, urban versus suburban. We're always pitting ourselves party versus party. This is about saving our democracy, period, right? Another question. How do we muster enough popular support to amend the Constitution and reform the electoral system? Nayela, I'm putting you on the hot seat.
You organize, you win. I think that sometimes organizing, structural reform, dismantling the Electoral College is such like a big vision. But we've achieved big visions in our history. But again, it begins with the local enlightenment of education, awareness, those conversations, meeting people where they are. I learned a lot of lessons working for the late congressman, but it's never lost on me on how, unfortunately, these fights can be generational. I worked with him years and years ago, not that long ago though. Many moons ago, but not that many moons ago. And I'm still fighting for the same issues that he fought for. A different landscape, different political actors, but the same fundamental fight. But I'm not discouraged because the starting point of my fight, where I picked up that torch from him, he brought me a lot further in that battlefield than I ever would have had I started without the efforts that he started generations ago. And this work in organizing can be very exhausting for those of us who do it full time. Yes, very exhausting. And it's also very inspiring. I'm always so moved and inspired by the people who do this work every day. I have the honor of sharing my platform in the ways that I can and when I can. But the wins that I've won, that I started never thinking that I would, but knowing that eventually we would cross that finish line, happened in the time frame they did, not because of anything that I did as an individual, not because I had any particular special type of knowledge, but because collectively we did a lot of things together, and that's how we won. And so I think, again, it sounds so difficult and so far away. This is, the fight for generations. But that fight begins today. It's already begun, but we just have to do, I'm a woman of faith, run our race, complete our assignment, and eventually we will win the race, and we will dismantle the Electoral College.
Yeah. You want to get in on this?
So, as someone who's been working on structural democracy issues for decades, will be kind to me and not mention how many. Structural democracy issues are definitively unsexy. I can tell you that. When we talk about how do we get people excited about things, I have never had anybody rally for redistricting. It doesn't happen, right? This is not.
I'm interested.
There's a reality out there that I think, but it is a generational fight. I remember talking to the late Jerry Hubert, and Jerry coming to me and being like, Keisha, I knew we'd be in this fight for these decades, but I didn't think it'd be the same fights, right? What does that mean? And I think it's been very important, not to be despondent, but to say this is a continuing fight, first. Second, that we do win. Right? We do see redistricting reform show up. We do actually see, New York, a very machine state, now has the largest public campaign finance system in the country. Right? These things happen, right? And so as we think about what that means, it means these fights can be won. And certainly the idea of amending the Constitution is, it's a huge lift. But the notion of saying what that means, how these things continue to be connected, how we continue to connect them together, I think feels very essential and important to me. Can I go back to the slavery question?
Please. Go
I
for it.
think one of the challenges I have, and whether or not the Electoral College, and because I am not the expert and I didn't write the book, I am not going to challenge the writer of the book. What I am going to suggest, however, is that there is not a single democratic system or structure that was designed when this country was founded that was not designed to shape and support the institution of slavery. And that means, as we think about these questions of structural racism and patriarchal norms, that we know when we the people didn't mean black people, when we knew that all men are created equal, expressly did not leave out women by chance, we knew women are not created equal. And 1920 may have been when white women showed up to the polls, but that is not when Native American women showed up to the polls, and is not when women of color showed up to the polls. We have to recognize that these structural interventions that show up for us are meaningful because of the way we experience them as people and as a country. And the evolution of these questions doesn't mean abandoning or even misstating history. I think we see the damage that happens. We see the damage that happens when we misstate, say, originalism, that how these things show up in really dangerous ways. But at the end of the day, the ability to say and see who we are, to understand the structures that were designed for a small, agrarian, homogeneous country are not going to be the same ones that serve a large, diverse country with a financialized economic system that we want to see meaningful equity for everybody to show up. It is gonna have to change. And you know, it's hard for all of us, maybe harder for white guys. And it is difficult to think about what these changes mean for each and every one of us, but the ability to say, when we all do better, indeed we all do better. And so while I do honor and respect the distinction that if you feel your power flows directly from your whiteness, you feel a loss. That is a legitimate loss. It is objectively harder to be a white guy and act with impunity today than it was 50 years ago. But as far as I'm concerned, it's not hard enough. And that's not to say we want people to feel harm, but the fact is, we want people to show up. We don't want power to be unequally distributed. We want the ability for people to be heard. We want, we understand that when you hold something, it always feels like a loss. I get that, I know. We were two. If you had any siblings, you knew, like, you know, that's why mom said, you cut it and you'd pick first, right? Like, and everyone became like, you know, mathematicians trying to get the perfect half, right? We know what that means and we understand what that means, but the fact is our country has changed, is changing, is going to continue to change. And how power has been held historically is going to have to shift, is going to have to change. And if anyone feels entitled to power simply by virtue of who they were or where they were born, this is not their America anymore.
Let's
talk about that.
I'm gonna look for my boss, who I think is gonna tell me we're done, right? Okay, we're good. Okay. I just want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much to Nayela, Carolyn, and Keisha for joining us this evening.